From Stanford, Goldman Sachs, and now to a startup. Today, we have Tyger Cho. Tyger, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start from the beginning. So what drew you to Stanford, and how did it shape your early career?
Yeah, in terms of what drew me to Stanford, so my family background is a little bit unique in that I'm one of 6 kids, and I also I also come from a lower income background. So growing up through middle school, high school, I actually didn't know that much about college education process, right? Both of my parents had attended University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and my whole expectation was that I would go there and study either accounting and or finance, which is what my parents had studied. So Stanford was not even on the radar, and because of my financial situation, I hadn't even considered going anywhere out of state, just because expense-wise, it would have been very difficult.
Right.
But as I thought about college admissions, I had a cousin who was at UCLA at the time when I was in high school. And I'd always thought it would be quite cool to be on the West Coast. And I was just following along with his journey and kind of what he was sharing. And I thought maybe I should apply to UCLA. And when I had mentioned that to my dad, he had basically said to pay out-of-state tuition and go to UCLA, it's just not feasible. It doesn't make any sense. But if you were to apply to Stanford and get in, because of our financial situation, you'd be able to go likely for free. And so my college admissions process was very unique in that I only applied to 2 schools. I applied to U of I and I applied to Stanford.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And even going through the process, like I didn't know anything about like the Ivy League schools, or I'd heard of the names obviously, but compared to most people that I ended up meeting at Stanford who had applied to a bunch of elite level schools and had multiple options, it was a very unique situation for me. And it was kind of a dramatic situation because I initially got waitlisted at Stanford. And I was proud and very happy to even be waitlisted. And then I eventually got in off the waitlist. And in many ways, that kind of changed the trajectory of my life.
That's really impressive. What was Stanford like to you? I mean, understandably, I would imagine that you're out of state, apart from family, living by yourself for the first time. Also, I would imagine a lot of kids there might have a very different background than you.
For sure. I think ultimately, like the Stanford experience was deeply formative. And I think I did a lot of maturing during those 4 years. I think the first year, my freshman year, was tricky just because by nature, I'm very introverted. And I was going into a whole new environment. And I think even just like California as a state in general, the amount of diversity of viewpoints and backgrounds is so much more radical than just kind of like Midwestern upbringing.
Right.
So it was a little bit disorienting at first, but meeting like incredibly smart people from all different backgrounds of some like very wealthy individuals with parents who were professors, entrepreneurs, like very successful in their own right. I think just in terms of understanding the world a little bit more, it was pretty incredible. And, we'll talk a little bit about this, but even the whole, I would say, startup spirit within Stanford. I had no aspirations when I was at Stanford to do anything startup related, but simply being exposed to that environment and the startup ecosystem, and many of my close friends and classmates at Stanford deciding to do something entrepreneurial, I do think that probably had it seeped into my personality and with what I'm doing with Cambridge now, I like to think that it had some impact. So overall, it was early years, definitely an adjustment period and a little bit disorienting, but I'm so grateful for the experience.
That makes sense. So it was planting early seeds in your mind. But I'm also curious, what drew you to Goldman Sachs? Because, if you go to Stanford, West Coast, and also the time that you were going through school, Silicon Valley was a boom. So I would imagine most of your peers would have been more interested or drawn to startup or, tech culture. I'm just curious, why did you make the decision to apply and get a job at Goldman Sachs?
So I think maybe a few factors. One is obviously my financial background. It was a key priority to have stability and to be financially in a very good, strong position, right? And so maybe the options at that point were either go big tech or go to Wall Street, right? And if you're an econ major at Stanford, which I was, the options for you are consulting, iBanking, or work for a big tech company and do something like strategy or business FP&A related. I was most interested in the Wall Street path, mostly because even when I was a junior and senior in high school, I was reading some like very basic investment books, like One Up on Wall Street with Peter Lynch, right? Or some of like the Buffett and Graham value investing. That kind of stuff resonated with me a lot. And even from a young age, I had always been financially minded, I would say. And so that seemed like the natural path. And then throughout Stanford, as I was studying economics, I did get deeply interested in following the markets. And I felt like the skill set that I had, which was much more analytical, methodical, very even-keeled in terms of managing my emotions, I thought that it would set me up well for a long-term career as some sort of an investment professional. So those were just my natural leanings, and anything related to tech, startups, high-risk investments, that stuff was not really, I didn't think it fit my personality well at the time, which is kind of what catered to me choosing a Wall Street path.
Right. For someone who is in similar position, they're maybe first generation going into college, do you have any advice for them? Would you make the same decision that you've made all these years ago? Or, has your experience changed your thought process a little bit?
I feel like I'm always very hesitant to give advice to people because everybody has a different personality, background. Everybody has different desires and aspirations for themselves. And also your aspirations and ambitions, they should naturally evolve over time as you mature.
Right.
So for me, like in terms of having regrets, I certainly don't have any regrets. And I also look back on the 2 years that I was at Goldman as some of the most formative professionally, because kind of similar to how Stanford just opened my aperture in terms of understanding the world, I think Goldman did that for me as well. And even with respect to working hard and intensity and being around other people that have equal levels of ambition, there no doubt is a downside to that as well. There's a cost to it. But to be exposed to it and to get a taste for it, and then you see other people in your career that haven't had that experience, you can kind of tell that there's a difference.
Right.
And so for me, especially in my 20s, I think my mindset has been try as many different things as you can because you ultimately don't know what you like. You can kind of predict and guess at the things that you'll like and you don't like. But until you're like on the ground actually trying a lot of that stuff, you won't know for sure, right? So for me, it was, this was the career path that I thought made most sense, that I thought fit my personality and a lot of the desires financially that I had. And so I thought it made the most sense. And then I think over the course of 2 years at Goldman, I kind of matured out of that or had new curiosities.
Right.
And so I tried something new, right? So I would recommend people, that are just graduating, if they do have the opportunity and they're in a position where it's, hey, from a financial position, this seems like a great opportunity. To start my career, it seems like a great opportunity. I haven't had these types of professional experiences before. I would say, give it a try and see how it is. If you're fortunate enough to land one of those jobs, you're in a great position to be in, right? So
absolutely, that's really smart.
I think that's kind of what I would say.
Got it. So let's talk a little bit about Goldman Sachs. So I'm just curious, what are the 3 most important things that you've learned there? Either personally or professionally.
I think in terms of the most important things. So for context, I spent half of my time on the wealth management, kind of asset management side, and then the other half of my time on the investment banking side. And I would say in terms of the most important takeaways, one is probably being able to position yourself well within a team environment. And like what I mean by that was when I was in Chicago, there are a bunch of different wealth managers, right? And I kind of strategically positioned myself to be on the largest asset management team in Chicago. And I was working for basically the most senior advisor in the Chicago office. And because of that, there were plenty of opportunities that were afforded to me that weren't afforded to other analysts. And there were other people that I was able to get connected to as a result of working for this individual that other analysts, entry-level analysts, didn't have access to. So I think that was, in hindsight, a very good strategic decision that I didn't even realize the benefits that would come from it. And so when I tried to transition into the investment bank, because of where I started, it was very beneficial to me.
Do you have any insights on how to best position yourself? Because I'm imagining if you're someone who's very junior, fresh out of college, you don't really have a lot of agency on, how to pick and choose different opportunities, that's available at your firm.
I think this is another thing about, because of my background was I didn't, grow up around a lot of other Asian Americans, not a lot of them. There were some, but I would say my background and the way that people interact with me. So for example, in my internship class when I was at Goldman, there were other Asian American backgrounds. And the things that I noticed, the differences between myself and them, is that their style or their approach was much more heads down, get the work done, and kind of be quiet, right? And I think that something that you have to learn, especially about being in an environment like Goldman, is that you have to be willing to take initiative and speak up and create new opportunities for yourself. Opportunities that may not even exist, right?
Right.
And so those were things that I was very proactive about when I was at Goldman. And I think some of the other, especially the Asian American backgrounds, where they were more tentative, was that they weren't as, I would say, assertive, And that's just part of a cultural gap, right?
Absolutely.
But I think that's something that was really important for me in hindsight, is there was actually an advantage that because I didn't grow up around a Korean American community, I didn't know some of those I should be less assertive, or maybe it's people think it's too forward.
Right.
That's actually creating some issues for me now, being in Korea and navigating a new cultural dynamic. But in the U.S., especially being at Goldman in the Midwest, when it's largely white American kind of background, I think that was something that a really powerful skill set that I.
No, that's really insightful. Earlier, you've mentioned that some of the lessons learned from Goldman really helped you on your current career path. I'm just wondering, how did those lessons stay with you in later pivots?
I think the other thing that I learned from Goldman, both in terms of things I wish I could have done better, but things that were ultimately valuable to me, were just how important relationships are, right? And I think this is another category where, especially Asian American backgrounds, maybe they don't realize the extent to which relationships in the workplace are so critical, right? It's oftentimes it's get the right answer or do the work well.
I think we're brainwashed into having merit, having the biggest factor of your success. But from what I've learned, and based on what you've said today, it seems like no, it's actually merit is more of a table stakes, but relationship is a key ingredient.
Yes, 100%. And I think this is something that I even didn't appreciate enough when I was at Goldman, right? Is that even in the asset management industry, for example, right? You might think that the best investors will attract the largest assets, right? But in an advisory business where you are advising clients who are incredibly wealthy, but maybe not financially sophisticated, the real differentiator is who can earn trust and who can manage relationships well, right? Even you might have a situation where you have somebody who is amazing at relationship building. They're not the best investment professional, but they're okay and they do a decent job, but they're a great communicator and they will win much more business than somebody who is an incredible investment, portfolio manager, but from a relationship management standpoint, kind of falters. And so I think seeing that at Goldman, that happened. And then also there's always politicking in any business, right?
Absolutely.
And especially the people that are high up there at Goldman or these other corporate firms, they realize that at the end of the day, relationships matter a lot, and that it's not always the most qualified person that will win. It's the person maybe who has the right connections or the right relationships, right? And I think that is maybe a harsh reality, but also a reality that's worth understanding about the world that I think I learned.
I think this is what all Koreans and Korean Americans need to know, because this is something or a key lesson that I miss. And I really wish someone told me when I was in my early 20s, just starting my career.
Right. And I think it's even, it's one thing to learn and understand it and another thing to execute on it. And I feel like
Right.
I'm learning this over and over again, even in my own journey as well.
Got it. So let's talk about inflection point. I mean, Stanford, Goldman Sachs, you're basically, golden child in terms of traditional career pathway. What prompted you to leave? What was that inflection point for you?
So I had always been a curious individual, like even when I was at Stanford. And part of the reason why I like doing these types of podcasts is because podcasting was a huge part of my life, even when I was at Stanford. And I was listening to maybe like 3 or 4 podcasts per day.
Oh, wow.
Right. And doing this for many, many years on end. When I got to Goldman, I think one of the things that was challenging was that I didn't have as much free time to stimulate my mind on topics that were not finance related. Right. And I think like ultimately because I didn't have that space to be intellectually curious, I was hungrier and hungrier for that. And I started to become a little bit impatient. And I started to open my mind, especially the second year that I was at Goldman, to what other career possibilities might exist where even if I'm making a little bit less money, I'm doing something where I have more agency over the projects that I'm working on, and I have a little bit more space to be intellectually stimulated. And there was a podcast that I had listened to pretty voraciously when I was at Stanford called Invest Like the Best. And basically the host, Patrick O'Shaughnessy, he was starting a new project called Deal Team, where he was trying to bring on investment professionals in his network that he had grown through his podcast and to bring them into a digital platform. And this was a new startup kind of project. And because I was contemplating new projects to maybe join and contribute to, and because it was so well suited to my background, I thought this was a very unique opportunity. Maybe I should make the jump and ultimately leave Goldman. And so, yeah, I decided to do that. It was not an easy decision. I think in hindsight, it was a very healthy decision. I learned a ton from it. But it's interesting because even the sequence was, I actually decided to leave Goldman first without having anything set up, which was actually a bit terrifying. And I don't know if I would recommend that unless people have like substantial runway to figure things out.
Right.
But I ended up leaving Goldman just because I felt like from, transitioning from wealth management to investment banking, even in wealth management, I was working a lot. But then in investment banking, I was working even more and on weekends. And it was starting to eat me alive, the fact that I didn't have as much freedom over my time and some of the projects that I was working on. And so that's what motivated me to say, all right, let me take a step away, take a couple of months off, do some job searching and see what else is out there. Very difficult decision at the time. But yeah, I'm glad I ended up trying.
That's a really good story. When you were leaving Goldman, was there any external conflicts? I'm asking just because, you've mentioned that you're pretty much self-made. When you're picking your first job, stability was something that was on top of your mind. And, launching yourself into ambiguity seemed not only difficult, but I would feel like your family and friends would have had at least something to say to you about, your choice.
Yeah, I think that because of my unique situation, which is, it's interesting when I compare myself to a lot of other like Korean Americans that had similar educational backgrounds.
Right.
They usually have either siblings who have done academically very impressive things or professionally very impressive things, and they have parents who've done something similar, right? And there's oftentimes a lot of social pressures. I think for my situation, I was mostly self-motivated. My parents never had to tell me to be studying or doing anything. They would usually tell me to relax because I'm a very intense person by nature. And because my parents, I think, they immigrated to the States when they were quite young, like 6 or 7 years old. So they have a much more American mindset than they do a traditional, I would say, Korean mindset. And I think that had been, in many ways, an advantage to me in terms of doing something like leaving Goldman. Because on the day I contemplated leaving Goldman, it was actually a day where I was very stressed work-wise. I was kind of getting to the limit of like being impatient with my job situation. And so I called my mom up and I had said, Mom, I think this is the end for me. I think I want to leave and explore new paths.
Wow.
And she didn't hesitate. She said, you should do it.
That's crazy.
Immediately, she was actually very relieved and happy because I think that in some ways she saw that I was maybe just like not feeling my best, psychologically, emotionally, because she knows that I have so many other curiosities, whether it's like reading books, listening to podcasts, taking on my own projects. And so she was incredibly supportive. I do think my dad maybe had some thought about, you're really on a great path, and are you sure you want to do this, right? Because there is huge opportunity cost to it.
Right.
And so him just knowing that and thinking about my future of, if I get married and if I have kids, it's really nice to have that safety and security and to build a stable foundation. So I think he was more so just one looking out for me, but ultimately both of them were very, very supportive.
For someone who's in a similar situation where, they don't really come from wealth, and if you're trying to map out game theory wise, the irony is that less fortunate you are, I think it's more difficult to tolerate additional risk to your life. Do you have any word of advice for someone who's just starting their career and also thinking about making potential moves or changes in their lives?
Yeah, I think the most important thing, and this is the same thing within the investment profession, is like the whole know yourself situation, right? I think I had tried to calculate how risk averse I was and how much risk I could handle. And I think I underestimated, or I don't know, maybe I overestimated. I mean, when I had made the decision, it was a very difficult decision. And then I think in the first 2 to 3 months, I was kind of terrified. Right. Because when you're working and you have people around you and it's 24/7, your whole identity gets wrapped up in your work.
Absolutely.
And then when you aren't seeing money hit your bank account and you aren't really sure what to do with yourself because all of your time was spent working, your entire identity gets pulled away from you. And so I think usually that's a very healthy thing, but sometimes there's a level of chaos that can be overwhelming, right? And so I do think that if you feel like you're going to put yourself in a position where you only have a 2 to 3 month window, and that's a very scary position to be in, that you should think long and hard about it. But I do think that, most people will make the decision that they know is right for them, in the sense that the people that can't handle that risk, they will never make that decision in the first place.
Interesting.
Unless something crazy happens, even, for me, seeing my peers at Goldman, a handful of them have told me when I was there that they had contemplated, wanting to do something entrepreneurial or independent. But I think they also knew that they couldn't get themselves to do it. Right.
Yeah, no, I was about to say, who doesn't?
Right. And so I think if you have a real deep underlying passion that is just eating you alive, that's kind of what I had. I felt like I'd be really regretting if I didn't try anything in my 20s.
Gotcha.
And take the jump. So that drive, that curiosity for another career path ultimately won out, and is why I left. But I don't think anything that somebody told me of advice that they gave me really persuaded me. It was something that I knew for myself that I had to do. So I'm always so hesitant, to tell people that are telling me oh, I'm thinking about quitting my job.
Right.
Because almost always it's a lot scarier of an experience than you anticipate it being. Same thing with the founder journey, I think.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
So let's talk about your life at a startup. So what was the biggest shock moving from Goldman Sachs to a startup?
The biggest shock was, and I think it varies based on the types of startup that you're working for. But for the startup that I was at, it was less than 10 full-time employees. I was shocked by, especially when you start your career, you only know so much. You only know that ecosystem that you were brought up in.
Right.
And because I was in the financial industry and working for Goldman, there's a lot of hierarchy, there's a lot of structure, there's a lot of protocols, there's a lot of compliance types of stuff that you have to manage. And that was the only world I knew. And so then when I moved to this startup ecosystem, it was so scrappy. It was, there are not set templates of what are the right answers, what are the wrong answers. The expectations in terms of responsibility of what I would do and bring to the table, it was, hey, there's not a road plan that exists. You need to develop the framework and you need to test things and you need to give us the roadmap. That was something that, especially in the first 3 to 4 months, was very disorienting for me. And it was a little bit uncomfortable. It was very uncomfortable, actually. And so I think that was the biggest adjustment was when you're just given tons of personal agency and you're not used to having that level of responsibility and decision-making authority, and you're not used to not having somebody above you tell you what to do or what they're looking for, it can be a level of freedom that is almost overwhelming. And I think that's what I had to some extent for the first 3 to 4 months, because even though I was working under chief operating officer of the firm, it was a startup ecosystem, and he was giving me projects that he had never undertaken before, and he was expecting me to execute on. So it was something that was just like so new to me, and I think ultimately healthy. But that was the biggest difference going from Goldman to a startup.
So starting your company from scratch is obviously a very different kind of risk than working for another startup.
Right.
So what gave you the conviction, and has the experience been any different from your previous, as working as a team member for someone else's startup?
Yeah. Currently, I'm really in a solopreneur type of situation right now. Right? I don't know if that's going to be the state of what Cambridge looks like for the near future. It really depends on whether or not I pursue funding routes or whether I try and bootstrap this and make this self-sustaining on its own right.
Right.
But it is a very different experience working at a startup with like 8 or 9 employees and the solopreneur path. I think the biggest difference is that when the lows in a solopreneur situation, they feel a lot lower because even when you go through hardship or periods of frustration and you have a team around you, that kind of social camaraderie, it offers a level of comfort that is psychologically it's helpful, right? And when you're alone doing it and you're bearing the brunt of the cost, it's a very different experience as a founder, I think. So I definitely think it's a lot harder choosing this independent path. On the flip side, it is also freeing to know that you live and die by the decisions that you make and that you're solely responsible for. Because even when you're working at a startup with less than 10 employees, there are maybe decisions that are made that you think are wrong, or there are team members who maybe you don't agree with the way that they're managing a project or executing on a project, or the intensity with which they're executing on a project. And so you don't have to deal with that, right? You don't have to deal with that when you are either founding the company yourself or you're in a solopreneur situation. So it is certainly a double-edged sword. And yeah, it's both harder and easier at the same time. Yeah.
No, that makes sense. And, wrapping this up, what would the 22-year-old Tyger say about your career path, if he was reading an autobiography about your story right now?
I think he would be, he'd be surprised, very surprised for sure, right? The 22-year-old me, even with the question of, advice that I give to other people thinking about starting their career at Goldman is, the 22-year-old me would have been probably in his first year at Goldman, and I was studying for the CFA at that point. I was working long hours, and I was expecting that I'd have a long career in the finance profession, right? So I think surprise would be the most notable reaction or emotion, but I ultimately think maybe a level of like respect or admiration is what I would hope as well. Is there has been a lot of maturing that's happened over the course of, the last 5 to 10 years. And I think that the types of people that I did admire when I was in my early 20s were people that were somehow able to carve their own path, right? And I think part of the reason why I wanted to at least try this, off the beaten path type of career was because the people that I was always drawn to were people who had interesting stories, right? And usually it's not did 2 years as an analyst, switched to private equity, then worked at a hedge fund, and then became like a VC, right? Even though those people have interesting stories in their own right, those weren't the types of people that I was naturally gravitating towards and wanted to hear from. It was oftentimes the people that I felt like were in the arena themselves, right? And there was real risk of like, if it didn't work out, there was no safety net, right? And I think, living this over the course of the last year and a half, I have even more respect for those types of people. So yeah, I think I would have thought that, what happened to my future self is a question that I would ask. But ultimately, I think that my younger self would be proud that I made some of those decisions. At the same time, a little bit confused at how did that unfold, or how did your appetites change? Because none of these entrepreneurial drives were really in question when I was in my early 20s.
Got it. No, that makes sense. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.